Okay.
We answered that. Sorry.
All right. So the question that got brought up today, or actually last night, was around Autopilot's motherboard replacement strategy. And so on Docs, we have this page here that explains what the different scenario guidance is, because there are a number of different scenarios you can be in when it comes to motherboard replacements. But the long and short of it is it's really right here in right here, starting right here in this area here. It says if the motherboard is replaced on Autopilot registered device with the following version of Windows, essentially the 21H2 and 22H2, both Windows 10 and Windows 11, these are the only supported releases. However, there's a KB that you would need for both 10 and 11, 21H2. You have to be on that KB or later. If you are on any of these supported releases of Windows and the device goes back to the same tenant without an OS reset, then what Autopilot's going to do is it's going to attempt to register the new hardware components. And so what you should see in Autopilot for the profile status is that you should see the device shows fixed pending as Autopilot attempts to register the new hardware components. If the new hardware components have successfully been registered, then the device status goes back to the assigned Autopilot profile, and everything should work as expected. However, if the device cannot be successfully registered, then the profile status for the device shows attention required. So all of this is when there is no OS reset. So imagine you replace the motherboard, but the hard drive stays the same. Then there's no OS reset. Then everything should just kind of fix itself. That's probably not a very common scenario. Like, and I don't go through a lot of motherboard replacements, so I don't know these days. But when you go and send out a device for repair and the motherboard's replaced, are they also taking the hard drive as well? Like, because the hard drive is typically soldered onto most of these laptops these days, or it's like an eMMC drive or something.
Not with all the Lenovo's we have. It's always a NVMe drive that's separate. And
okay.
We don't send them out. We do a lot of in-house repairs, and so this is pretty common for us. We see this multiple times a week.
So you keep the hard drive and you're keeping the OS intact?
Correct.
Oh, you are? Okay.
Yeah, so we just need to suspend BitLocker, put the drive back in, and then BitLocker fixes itself, DPM registers, and then we have to wait till the user logs in to then sign them out of Office 360 work and school to then clear. Because if you just try and open Office, you're going to get the TPM error that I posted.
Right.
And it's not clear to the client what the heck that even means. And so you have to sign out of work and school, but you have to do that for within the user's client. But we don't have Autopilot set up. So these are ones where they're Intune registered as part of Office sign-in.
Okay. And how about for those of you that do have Autopilot set up, is this process working the way that it's described here? For those that are keeping their hard drives and they're keeping the OS intact, are you seeing the fix pending and then it auto fixes itself?
Go ahead, Mike. He might just be raising his hand. Like me too.
I didn't mean to do it like 14 times. Sorry. I see fix pending a lot, but it doesn't seem to ever fix.
So it just goes into the fix pending, and so, but the OS itself is been maintained. So the hard drive you just swapped the board, but the OS is still the same as it was before. You didn't re-image or reset.
Is the OS being retained like a required thing? Because I mean, we've had Intune for a pretty long time, and we just started deleting them like all the Intune, the Azure, and the Autopilot record. We just purge them out every time we do a motherboard replacement.
Yeah, that's pretty common for what most people used to do, or that was the guidance that we had a while back. But then we recently changed the guidance that if you're on a supported release of Windows as of whatever the KB versions that we have listed here, and the device is going back to the same tenant without an OS reset, then you should go into this fixed pending state.
Gotcha.
And then eventually it should fix itself. However, if the device can't be fixed, so like if you reimage the machine, for instance, then in that case you would probably see that the profile status should be attention required.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. So I'm curious for those of you that, if this process is working, I'm seeing some stuff in the chat. I haven't read through it.
They're just all saying the same thing. That everyone's seeing the same thing.
Okay. Same here. We have to reset as well. 90% shows attention required. We see the fix pending, but it never changes. HP notebooks. And then Dan links out to Rudy's blog. Okay. Yeah, so this is the process that's supposed to happen. And if you're following these steps, this should be what happens. Sounds like a lot of folks are stuck in fix pending. I've seen a number of devices get stuck on fix pending, but didn't know the history of the devices. Okay. Sorry, trying to catch up on the chat here. Okay. So there's that. Now, when it comes to the actual replacement or the deregistration of the device, so if the OEM is resetting the OS, then the device needs to be re-registered. Now, again, we talked earlier about if the OS is being maintained or if you're maintaining the hard drive, then the OEM isn't going to reset the OS because there's no hard drive, there's no OS for them to reset. And so if they are doing that, then they'll have to follow all of these steps. First step is you need to deregister from Autopilot. Now, deregistration becomes a little tricky depending on who did the original registration. So as you go through this doc, there's a section down here that talks about who is responsible for the deregistration depending on how it was registered. So if you registered it, meaning if you uploaded the hardware hash via CSV or PowerShell or what have you, then you are the one responsible for deregistering that device. If the OEM registered it, then they're the ones responsible for deregistering it because they can go through Partner Center and do the deregistration on your behalf, whereas you can't deregister their device that they've actually registered. So, so we talk about that whole process, what the deregistration looks like. I'm not gonna go through all the steps, but you can kind of just see that all this stuff here explains how that deregistration happens. Then we talk about how the replacement of the motherboard happens, and there's all sorts of details here about the information that's in the BIOS and the digital product key that the OEM has to put back into the BIOS once they've replaced the board. And oftentimes OEMs don't do this right. I've seen a lot of support requests and emails come through around how the BIOS didn't get reset correctly. And so sometimes you're missing your product key, or sometimes you could be missing some other attributes. That's somewhat common that we've seen. And then capturing the new autopilot hash. If your OEM's doing this, then you as a customer don't have to worry so much about this because the OEM is going to re-register the device on your behalf with that new autopilot device ID because the hardware is actually changed. So they'll do that. If they aren't doing that and you're the ones responsible, then you'll have to reharvest the hashes and upload them. And so we show all the guidance on how to do that. And then resetting the device. Now, this could be done either in the built-in reset in Windows, or you could just reimage. And then there's this new section here that I just noticed this morning when I was reading Jonathan's question around specific repair scenarios. This wasn't here last time I looked at it, so this is somewhat new. But we do show, depending on the scenario, what the Microsoft recommended steps are to go through. Now, these obviously aren't steps. These aren't complete steps for just you. There are some things that you should do, and there's some things that your OEM is likely going to have to do. So if you've registered devices, for instance, through CSV, then you would be the one to go and deregister the device out of Autopilot. And this is something that most of us have actually been doing for a while, that have been using Autopilot. Is you've been like Mike just mentioned, deleting the device out. Both Autopilot, of Intune, and everything, and then you're sending the device back to the OEM. They're going to replace the motherboard, whatever other hardware that needs to be replaced. The device is then going to come back to you, and then either you or the OEM is going to register the device, and then you're going to reimage it and go about, or use whatever OS was already on the machine before. So we've got the recommended steps depending on the scenario, and there's a ton of scenarios here, depending on if you have a TPM versus you don't have a TPM, if BIOS info is excluded because the OEM didn't have the BIOS tool or they did something, crazy that they shouldn't have done. So there's a lot of different scenarios here to kind of go through. So, so I think I posted this earlier in chat. Yeah. So you guys all have access to that link. Keep it handy if you're kind of curious, if you need to reference this again. But this is all the guidance that we have on motherboard replacements.
Yeah, I mean, one comment is just I actually haven't seen this whole specific repair scenarios section either, and it's pretty good, pretty detailed.
Yeah, it's pretty detailed, but most of the steps are mostly the same, at least from a customer perspective.
Yeah.
The only difference is a lot of the stuff on the OEM side where depending on what you're doing, you might have to put there's a repair digital product kit, digital product key that is pre-injected into the BIOS. So a lot of the stuff I think that's different in these scenarios are primarily for the OEM. But it's good for you to know exactly what the OEM is supposed to be doing. And when you get these devices back, if they're not doing what they should be doing, then you'll know, hey, if they didn't put the product key in the BIOS, then we're probably gonna have a problem. Not necessarily, you may not have a problem with autopilot per se, but you will have a problem with something like subscription activation. Like the device won't activate. So you could have some issues there. All right, back in the chat, we've got Randy saying, I've seen a number of devices get stuck on fixed pending, but didn't know the history on those earlier. Brad mentions the biggest frustration we have to submit ticket after ticket with Microsoft since motherboard refurbs we get from warranty. Microsoft handles it and we have a process, but it is a lot. Yeah. And then Randall says, I hadn't realized until we hit errors that Microsoft 365 uses TPM. Is there documentation for that? Is TPM required for Microsoft 365? TPM is not required for Microsoft 365, at least if you're seeing something documented that says it. There isn't any requirements that I'm aware of for anything that says.
Well, I think he's referring to the picture that I sent. It gives you a TPM error, like because it's called key set does not exist. The platform manager function. I think it's if there is a TPM present on the system when you log into Office 365, it caches some kind of token in the TPM, and when you place the motherboard, that token is gone, and so it's looking to grab that token from the TPM, and TPM's like, I don't got nothing, and then it just gives you that error message.
But that's the client, right? The Office client itself. Yeah.
The Office itself does that.
Okay.
Yeah, so if we're storing secrets in the TPM, then and we can't access those secrets, and you're trying to auth to something, then yeah, that I could see that happening. But there's no formalized requirement to use TPM for something like Microsoft 365 apps.
Yeah, because I think if you don't have a TPM, it just stores them somewhere else in the system that doesn't use the TPM.
It might even be activation.
Back. Could be.
Yeah, that's the first time I've seen that error. But yeah, but there isn't any requirement for the app to function or for that to happen. It's interesting.
Yeah, it's something to dig into.
It's hard to reproduce because I tried to take the hard drive out and put it into another computer, and it doesn't cause that error. It seems to only cause that error if you actually replace a motherboard on a system.
Interesting. Yeah, hadn't seen that one. And Joseph says we've had TPM error for N365 when updating TPM firmware as well. That's interesting. And Keith is asking, has the Intune team had a conversation with the licensing team to figure out how to make the licensing grouping make sense? The OS platform and licensing device policy has to be duplicated multiple times based on the total number of devices that need to be licensed in the organization. Hey, Keith, I don't know if you want to come off mute and clarify your question a little bit. I'm not quite sure how to answer this one.
Okay, can y'all hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So, so one of the major things that we fight with within Intune is properly licensing our devices. So, um, so the State Department of Education manages thousands and thousands of machines across the state, and so pretty much we have to get very creative when we are when we deploy the device policy for OS upgrade and platform update to make sure that we're using our enterprise licensing instead of OEM licensing. And yeah, it is the repetitive nightmare that keeps on giving.
So are you talking about the subscription license that's on the user? So when you go to like admin.microsoft.com, there's a Windows 10/11 enterprise license. Is that the license you're talking about?
Yeah, I think that's the one that used to be, I think that's the one that replaced the volume licensing
Yeah.
scenario. So yeah, so I mean, so pretty much the license grouping is either in groups of 500 or 1,000. Well, in our scenario, I mean, we have well over 4,000 machines, and so just the mixing and matching and trying to figure out how to reconcile all that and make it make sense. Like I said, it's an adventure.
And so are you using group-based licensing within Azure Active Directory to target?
To target users, yes.
Yeah. Okay. But you're
I
saying
mean, that's fine from a user point of view, but from a machine point of view, when we need to push the actual enterprise licensing to the machine to make sure that it has, all the fun stuff for software assurance and
Are you talking
upgrades
about
all
the
of that.
SKUs, like the addition of Windows going from like Pro to Enterprise or Pro to Education?
Correct.
yeah, I guess
I hope that makes sense.
no, well, I'm confused because with group-based licensing, like if I'm just trying to upgrade a machine from Pro to Enterprise or Education, I deploy out a license through either group-based licensing or through admin.microsoft.com, and that license, once it's been deployed, you'll upgrade if it's on Pro, it'll upgrade to Enterprise. If it's on Pro Education, it'll upgrade to the Education SKU. But you shouldn't have any limitations on only 500 to 1,000 machines. We should be able to target a lot more than that.
Right. So it's not necessarily. I mean, it's not necessarily a function of Intune more than it is a function of how the licensing team does the grouping quantities for licensing.
Are you purchasing device-based licenses at all?
Say again?
You're not purchasing any device-based licenses, are you?
We still have quite a few device-based licenses. I mean, we haven't completed the full transition over to user-based licenses, but yeah, we still have some device-based licensing.
Tell you what, Keith, why don't you send us an email and let's follow up on it. I think we can take this offline and I think we can help you figure it out. If you don't mind, I'll throw my email in the chat for you.
Okay, sounds good.
Awesome. Thanks, man.
Yeah. This shouldn't be any sort of limitation there. I think there might just be something that needs to be looked at.
Yeah. I think we can help.
Okay, what else we got?
Randall's hand is up. Randall, you want to come off mute? Oh, you sound like a. I have him sounding kind of like a robot Chipmunk?
Yeah,
Anyone else? Okay.
yeah, you've got. There's some pretty interesting feedback coming from you, Randall. All right, Randall, you might want to join, come back and rejoin. All right.
See, I'm still getting caught up on chat, so
Yeah. Insane.
don't KMS default activation keys manage those SKUs for you?
Yeah, so Austin's comment here is for KMS.
Yeah.
KMS, I mean, if you were using KMS, then yeah, KMS would just upgrade the device as well. But if you go back to when the pandemic started, KMS was actually pretty problematic for those that sent devices home with people. And after 6 months, because you get 180 days for activation, a lot of people were having issues with devices that were falling out of activation because they couldn't hit the KMS server because they just didn't have line of sight to the KMS server. So, what most people that are going cloud native should be doing is actually using subscription activation, which is what Garrett had linked to. And the premise behind that is that if you are using Autopilot, or even if you're not using Autopilot, if you just buy Windows Pro or Pro Education devices, and you assign the Windows 10 or 11 enterprise license to your users, when they sign into the machine will change to enterprise or education depending on which SKU the device was shipped with. And so that's our recommended way of activating moving forward, instead of leveraging KMS. However, KMS is still going to be around. It's not going anywhere, but we're not really investing anything new into it. So most that are going on this cloud native journey as they're trying to get off of on-prem, getting rid of that KMS server is beneficial. It's not have to manage it, to patch it or update it. And your devices can just be anywhere. They don't have to be on campus, and with remote work and remote learning and all that's going on now. Not everyone's got access to VPNs, so they can't communicate directly to that KMS box. So this is just the evolution of activation and licensing, is to take advantage of subscription activation.
Yep.
So similar to
do I sound better now?
Hey, much better.
Okay, cool. Got my headset on. So there was a discussion that came up in the high ed list, which seems to be a lot of frustration, and it has to do with like student and personal machines when they're accessing, I guess, our tenant resources. A lot of them, I guess the issue is a lot of them without the user knowing, they're getting BitLockered, and then the BitLocker key is getting escrowed into the Azure tenant.
Yeah.
And so they're like, the high ed community is like, these are not our machines and they're not our keys. And not only do we not want to be managing them, we shouldn't have them. Right?
Yeah. Are you having the same problem too?
I mean, we see some of it, but it's not as big. But it's definitely a issue. I mean, we didn't even really look for it, but
yeah,
I've definitely seen instances of people with personal systems have not even realized their system was BitLockered and have no idea where their key is.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it's a challenge because there's really three ways, or three registration types within Azure Active Directory, or now Entra ID, to get a device into Entra ID. You've got Azure AD join, you've got hybrid Azure AD join, then you have Azure AD registration. And the registration piece is what these personal devices are using, because what's happening in that scenario is that the end user is probably trying to get access to some Office 365 app or Microsoft 365 app. Typically Outlook, they'll try to get access to their email. And so when you sign into your Office apps, your M365 apps with your work or school account, the very first thing that pops up is hey, do you want to add this device to your organization? It's going to make things a lot easier. It's going to give you single sign. It doesn't tell you all these things. It just basically says it's going to make your life a little easier. But what it's really doing is it's registering the device to your organization's tenant. That doesn't mean that it's actually registering it to Intune. It's registering it to Azure AD. Now, if you are using Intune and you're not blocking personal device enrollment, then it will also go into Intune. But if you do block personal device enrollment, then it's just going to be registered to Azure AD. And the reason that this is a thing primarily comes down to conditional access, where if you're trying to use Office 365 apps, you as an IT admin would want to make sure that the user that's actually doing this has a device that's actually secure. Like they don't have something that's super out of date that has, BitLocker turned off or, firewalls turned off. Like, there's all the stuff that we can do in a compliance policy in Intune. You'd want to have a conditional access policy that leverages a compliance policy that you can target to these machines. And to make sure that the device is secure when it's accessing organization data. And so that's why that's a thing. Problem though, and it's a thing that I'm not too happy about, is that we don't have the ability to turn it off. You can block personal device enrollment in Intune, but you can't block the Azure AD registration or the Entra ID registration of a device through Azure AD. And that's a problem. Because now you end up with all these other devices in your tenant, and it's not, from a management standpoint, it's just it creates this mess. And then also because of how BitLocker functions with certain device types, because you probably won't see this with every single device that a end user uses, but if you do use devices that automatically encrypt, when they registered Azure AD, you may see those BitLocker recovery keys show up. And so I think that's where this is stemming from. But the reason Randall asked why, if you were seeing this problem, is because I was curious if you have a BitLocker policy and you have personal device enrollment allowed, and if you're seeing those versus if you don't have personal devices allowed in Intune, and therefore, you would, whether BitLocker was configured or not doesn't matter, because the device isn't actually touching Intune. I'd be curious if you just have personal devices showing up, but they're not actually in Intune, if you're seeing those keys. Because that's not a scenario that I've validated yet to see if the key actually shows up or not. And so I'm just curious if you had noticed that.
Yeah, I'm not speaking from like we've had a major significant problem with it ourselves. It's more of a conceptual, seeing the discussion going on. We're still, I'm not even on the team that's piloting us into Intune.
Right.
So we're not even in, but I always try to keep an ie out for this, because then we can go in and say, hey, here's an issue. We got to make sure that we configure this right, so that we run into this problem. Because, there was a big discussion, I think, was it Georgia, Ohio State, Stanford have said that they've had significant issues with this. Now, I don't know their specific setup, but
yeah,
I think they've been throwing it around, and I'm just interested and was curious on whether there's a right way to set that up. And as you indicated, there's there are things. So I could bring it up and say, like, here's I think this was Wisconsin had put a page on it on what they had been seeing, and kind of a best practice. But I guess in the bigger issue too, I think outside of higher ed, I think there's not a real good communication on to just regular, users that, oh, hey, your system has been BitLockered and your key is here, right? Where, people come in and they get a hardware problem and they're like, oh, I'm sorry, I can't access your drive. It was encrypted. And they're like, huh? What's BitLocker?
Yeah, well, and the problem with that is depending on the device type. So, for instance, if you buy like a Surface laptop or Surface Laptop Go, actually just basically any newer Surface device, those devices use what's called modern standby or connected standby. And those devices, because they support that sleep mode, the different sleep states like S3. There's one called S0-I, and that's the method that Surface uses, and other OEMs can use it too. I don't see it as prevalent across all the other OEMs. Some do, but not every one of their devices would actually support that sleep state. But if you support that sleep state, your device will actually automatically encrypt when you go through the out-of-box experience. And because it's automatically encrypting, then imagine that, if you go through autopilot, or not autopilot, but if you go through Ubi and you add your work or school account there, or you go into settings later and add it there, the key can then get escrowed to Azure Active Directory. And you, as an IT admin, if you're blocking personal enrollment of these devices, then you're not pushing BitLocker. And the user didn't turn on BitLocker because they wouldn't know, most of them wouldn't know how to do that. And so it's just the OS is doing it for you depending on the hardware that you purchased. And so so you're right that the user has no idea. No one has it. Most IT admins have no idea that this is happening, unless you read through Microsoft Docs or if you've just ran into this problem before. So yeah, I totally agree that there should be some notification, especially during like the out-of-box experience, like a page in there or something that just tells the user, hey, we're encrypting your device, and depending on what you've done up to that point, your recovery key is here. Whether that's your OneDrive, whether that's local, whether just tell them where it's at so they know, or hey, you need to save this, put this in a safe place, kind of thing. So I agree.
So I just looked at our tenant and I found a machine that was Entra registered that is not enrolled in Intune that has a BitLocker key stored in our. So I think it does not need to actually enroll into Intune for the BitLocker keys to get backed up or have any policy, because we don't have any policies that set that.
Right. Yeah. And that's kind of what I was expecting, is that you probably are seeing those keys. Yeah, and there's really nothing you can do because it's the end user's machine. They're just signing in, and that's the problem that I've got here with this whole, you can't block registration. At one point I thought blocking personal enrollment did work, and what's really interesting, and you can try this, about probably 6 months ago when I last tested this, was that if you as an admin are trying to register a device. So if you just went into settings, clicked on, your accounts, go to connect, and you try to register a device, as a local admin, you will be blocked from doing the Azure AD registration. It won't register the device into Azure AD. But if you sign in as a standard user, do the same exact thing, try to register it to Azure AD, the device will register, but you'll get the blocked message that you've been blocked from enrolling into management, but the device still shows up as registered. So it's this weird difference where if you're a local admin on the machine, it shouldn't show up as registered. At least that's in my experience in testing this, that didn't work. But standard users would show up. And so when you look at the vast majority of people with personal devices, they most likely are going to be admins, but that's not always going to be the case.
Was that using the at the pro sign-in box using, or if you installed Enterprise using the join the domain instead, making that a local account, or are you going through the Ubi?
No,
doing the forcing the test the local.
Yeah, if you went through Ubi, and then if it'll ask you like who owns the device, whether that's
personal or
your work or whatever.
Yeah.
And if you click on work and you add in your email address, that actually does a personal enrollment
Yeah.
You might think that it does a corporate enrollment because you're saying it by work device or whatever, but it actually does a personal enrollment. And using that account, you would be a local admin, and that enrollment would it would block the registration of like you wouldn't see that device actually register into Azure AD. At least that's about 6 months ago when I was looking at this again. It seems to be like every 6 months, this kind of topic always comes up.
Okay, because I've also seen a whole bunch of devices where if people went through that dialog box and if they select the corporate, it registers the device as a corporate owned device with the Intune box of like, is this personal or is this corporate owned? And that selecting that sets it to corporate owned.
Should be personal. I'll have to go back and test it again, but I'm pretty sure that's a personal role.
Okay. And this was you tested this on Pro?
Yeah, Pro.
Yeah. This is why we said we need a session on BitLocker.
It'd probably take like a month to actually prepare like a deck to go through all the permutations. But yeah, it's more complicated.
I mean, it looks like there's a lot of comments on this one. Really quick, we only have a couple of minutes left. I know Casey's had his hand up, so Casey, why don't you jump off mute really quick and ask your question or comment?
Well, the only thing I wanted to say was I'm Casey from Dallas College. The thing that we had the most success with in terms of starting to get control of that was not allowing personal devices be enrolled into Intune, but then also start flagging and filtering any device that's been registered but not Intune. So it's like usually like a custom filter. You have to do like some graph API stuff to kind of get the list and then kind of filter out the list with the like a joined search of like both it's registered, its status is registered, and it's not in Intune, so it isn't pull up from like a custom query of your devices in Intune. And then from there, when you're talking about OEM devices, replacements, other avenues of those keys being generated, we had to generate kind of a custom alert basically that tells us, hey, key has been generated, and we had to kind of like be on the lookout for that. Because it is happening. But I just also wanted to add that the idea of the key being put in, even though the device is not in Intune, is really key, because I hate the fact that I just did that, but is really key because understanding that fast of it and being able to find that out quickly lets you better investigate where they're coming from versus automatically going to Intune and then trying to dig through Intune, because that's what we spend a lot of time doing at Dallas College.
That's a good point. It's a good point, Casey. Yeah, I don't know if there's anything that you'd want to share with the community, like any scripts or anything that might help them out. The thing that we can do is just kind of impress on our Azure AD team that this is a problem that and I think I don't know. I mean, my guess is that it's not just this really shouldn't be just an education problem, right? Like it's not going to be just the education industry. I would imagine that commercial customers are probably in the same boat, given that people have all sorts of different devices and they're probably trying to get access to things from personal devices versus. So I think this is a problem that everyone has. I don't think it's just going to be like a higher ed thing or a K-12 thing. So yeah, this is definitely some feedback that we'll get out to the engineering teams.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that was in the high ed list is, I mean, they're bringing it up, and it's been known for a while.
Yeah.
But the frustration was they've been bringing it up with various Microsoft teams, and it really hasn't gone anywhere, and it's been dropped a couple times.
Yeah. Yeah, and then that's the frustration that we have too. Like this is something that we brought up years ago, and we thought that we had a solution with blocking personal enrollments of devices in Intune. And again, that kind of goes back to my point where, if you were to test this out with a local admin account that was trying to register, like it was blocked. But then if you try to do the same thing with a standard user account, it's like, oh, it actually worked. And so it was like, well, why would one work and not the other? And I think maybe there's just a bug there where that, when someone developed this and they tested it out, they're probably testing with an admin account and hey, it's blocked, I'm good. And they signed off on it and they went and worked on something else. And so they may not have tested the standard user scenario. And now these standard user devices are all here and, they just kind of stopped focusing on that aspect of things. So yeah, I'll try and see if we can get some more traction on this one, because it's definitely a problem.
Yeah.
All right. Well, okay, we're at the top
We're
of the
at
hour,
time. Yep.
and there's a lot of stuff in this chat that I cannot read.
It's
out.
good.
Don't read
That's a lot
that.
of
That's just a
questions.
sample of somebody saying, where they had escalated and it didn't go
Yeah.
anywhere. I just wanted to
Gotcha.
give an example.
Got it. Yeah. No, there's a bunch of other messages that I haven't read yet in the chat too. So I
Yeah,
think
a lot of sentiments shared. Okay. Awesome. So thanks for a great session, all. I guess we will see you all in 1 week for a special Halloween edition. I still expect everyone in costume. Thanks for attending today. This is EDU Endpoint Office Hours. Great conversation. Thanks, Richard, for leading, as always. And we will see you guys next week.
All right.
Take care, guys.
Later.
Bye.